Mr. Mercer, you've accumulated $14,200 in unpaid HOA assessments. Pay within 30 days or we file a lien and begin foreclosure on this property.
Ma'am, I've never signed your CC&Rs, not one page.
Doesn't matter. Your land falls within our 2003 boundary expansion. Membership is automatic. The clock starts today.
She said automatic the way people say inevitable, like the word itself locks doors. She was already turning back toward her Range Rover before I finished exhaling. I didn't stop her. Not because I had nothing to say. I had plenty. I'd spent the previous night reading a specific 9-line covenant buried in an 1868 territorial deed, language drafted by a land attorney who wrote things to survive generations, not just lawsuits. Language that made Victoria Hale's entire boundary expansion filing worth less than the paper it was recorded on. I could have told her that right there on the porch. 30 seconds. Done. But here's what 31 years of engineering teaches you. Never interrupt a structural failure while it's still building pressure. Let it load. Let it commit. Let it go far enough that when it finally gives way, there's no question about what caused it and no way to pretend otherwise. So I picked up my coffee. I watched her drive out. I noted the time, 9:14 a.m., a Tuesday in April, the way I note timestamps on field surveys. Not because I was angry, because I already knew this moment was going to matter later, and I wanted the record clean. She thought my silence was confusion, maybe fear, maybe the quiet resignation of a man who doesn't know how to fight back. She was wrong about all three. When someone reads your stillness as weakness, how much does that mistake end up costing them? The ranch was built in 1868 by my great-great-grandfather, Elias Mercer, a Union Army surveyor who came west after the Civil War and decided the high desert outside what would eventually become Flagstaff was worth staying for. He wasn't a romantic. He was a practical man who understood load-bearing walls and water tables and the specific angle of winter sun across an elevated plateau. The adobe he chose wasn't aesthetic. It was thermal mass. Those walls hold heat through the night and shed it by afternoon. They've been doing it without complaint for 157 years. I grew up in that house, left for Arizona State. Came back with an engineering degree and a woman named Carol who had grown up in Tucson and had never seen a territorial ranch up close. She walked through every room on her first visit like she was reading a primary source document, fingers along the hand-hewn timber beams in the main hall, crouching to examine the original adobe courses in the east wall, counting them the way you count rings in a cross-section. This was built by someone who expected it to outlast them, she said. That was the moment I knew she understood the place. Carol was a historical records librarian by training. She treated primary documents the way surgeons treat instruments, with precision, with respect, with the understanding that handling them carelessly has consequences that outlast the moment. Over 15 years, she cataloged every structural detail of the ranch, original materials, modifications, deed history, water rights, easement records. 3 notebooks. Her handwriting, neat, with small red annotations, filled every page. She passed 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 9 months from diagnosis to the end. She used most of them, making sure the record of this place was complete. The notebooks are still in the top drawer of my desk. I haven't moved them. I am 58 years old. 31 years as a civil engineer, bridges, drainage systems, county infrastructure. Work that requires patience and precision and the understanding that what you build will be tested long after the last signature dries. You don't cut corners in civil engineering. The failures don't show up the next day. They show up a decade later, and everyone agrees they could have been prevented. I live alone now. 42 acres. Main house, barn, 3 outbuildings, a well that has never run dry. I am not a man who raises his voice. It isn't temperament, it's closer to discipline. In 30 years of project work, I learned that the people who shout in meetings are usually the ones who haven't finished the math. Noise is what you make when you don't have the numbers yet. When you have the numbers, you put them on the table and let them speak. Carol used to say I had a gift for waiting. She didn't mean it entirely as a compliment, but she wasn't entirely wrong either. There's a principle I developed somewhere around year 12 of my career after a county bridge project in Yavapai nearly went sideways because a project manager panicked and issued a change order before the soil report came back. The principle is simple. Never make a permanent move in response to a temporary pressure. The soil report, when it finally arrived, confirmed the original design was correct. The change order cost the county $60,000 and 3 weeks of rework. The project manager wasn't incompetent. He was just afraid of the silence between the question and the answer. He couldn't hold still long enough to let the information arrive. So he moved too soon, and the movement itself became the problem. I've thought about that project many times since Victoria Hale walked off my porch. The temptation, in the days that followed, was to call her back immediately. To pull out Carol's third notebook, read her Article 9 annotation into the phone, and watch the whole thing collapse before it started. I had the instrument. I knew how to use it. The filing from 1868 was ironclad. Victorian land attorneys wrote for permanence, not convenience, and the covenant language was specific enough to make a modern judge uncomfortable even trying to argue around it. But I kept coming back to the same question. What exactly would I be winning? If I called Victoria Hale on day 2 and cited the covenant, I'd win the immediate argument. She'd back off. Maybe she'd even apologize. The practiced, non-committal kind that means nothing and costs nothing. And then she'd move on to the next property, the next elderly neighbor, the next manufactured violation, the next distress sale to her affiliated LLC, bought at 40 cents on the dollar while the former owner was still confused about what had happened to them. I'd have protected myself and handed everyone else back to her. That wasn't winning. That was just getting out of the way. There's a particular kind of patience that isn't avoidance. It's accumulation. Every day you hold still, if you're doing it right, you're collecting something. A pattern, a record, a timeline that someone with authority will eventually need to see laid out clearly, with dates and documents and a chain of events clean enough that no defense attorney can muddy it. I've built enough infrastructure in my life to understand the difference between a load-bearing element and a decorative one. The covenant was load-bearing, but one beam doesn't make a structure. You need the full frame before the thing can hold weight. I wasn't going to use my strongest piece of evidence to win a single argument. I was going to use it to end the entire operation. But first, I needed to understand exactly what that operation was. How certain do you have to be before you decide the right move is no move at all? Let me be clear about what was actually at stake. This wasn't a dispute about lawn maintenance schedules or approved exterior paint colors. Victoria Hale had filed a document with Coconino County claiming my property owed her organization $14,000, money I had never agreed to pay, for membership in an association I had never joined, under rules I had never signed. And if I didn't pay within 30 days, she had the legal mechanism to place a lien on a deed that predated Arizona's statehood by 44 years. A lien on this property wasn't a financial inconvenience. It was a cloud on title. It would complicate any future sale, any estate transfer, any refinancing. It would attach itself to the deed the way rust attaches to iron, slowly, then completely. And if she followed through to foreclosure, the process itself would become the punishment, regardless of the outcome. Legal fees, court appearances, months of procedural attrition designed to exhaust people who don't have the resources or the stamina to keep fighting. I had seen this before. Not to me, to others. An 81-year-old woman 2 properties over named Margaret Osley had received a similar notice 8 months earlier. Code violations, the HOA claimed. Improperly maintained fence line. Unpermitted outbuilding. She'd called me, confused, asking if I knew anything about HOA authority in Coconino County. I told her what I knew, which wasn't enough at the time. 6 months later, her property had transferred to a limited liability company registered in Scottsdale. Margaret was living with her daughter in Tempe. I thought about Margaret when I looked at Victoria's letter. I thought about Carol's notebooks in the desk drawer, the handwriting, the red annotations, 15 years of careful documentation by a woman who understood that the record of a place is part of the place itself. I thought about what it would mean to watch this ranch pass out of the family not because of debt or disaster or time, but because a real estate developer with a clipboard had found a faster way to manufacture both. The 30-day clock was running. If I moved wrong, too early, too loud, too incomplete, I'd win a skirmish and lose the war. If I moved right, I could stop this permanently. Not just for myself. I had roughly 3 weeks to make sure I was moving right. The first thing I did was drive to the Maricopa County Recorder's office. Not Coconino, Maricopa. Because that's where Pinnacle Ridge Development LLC had originally filed its incorporation documents, and I wanted to understand the full corporate structure before I looked at anything else. 31 years of infrastructure work teaches you to read the foundation before you inspect the walls. The surface tells you what someone wants you to see. The foundation tells you what's actually holding the weight. The clerk pulled the 2003 boundary expansion filing without any difficulty. It was a public record. Anyone could have requested it. Most people never think to. I sat at the reading table for 40 minutes with the filing and a yellow legal pad. The boundary expansion described a perimeter adjustment that extended Pinnacle Ridge HOA's jurisdiction approximately 0.4 miles northeast of its original recorded boundary, which, if the coordinates were accurate, placed my ranch's western parcel line inside their claimed territory. The filing cited an Arizona statute governing HOA annexation of adjacent properties. It had been recorded by a title company in Scottsdale. It bore the signature of the Pinnacle Ridge HOA board president at the time, not Victoria Hale, but a man named Robert Caslin whose name I didn't recognize yet. I wrote down everything: dates, recording numbers, signatory names, the specific statute cited. Then I pulled my own deed. The 1868 territorial deed to the Mercer Ranch had been recorded in the original Yavapai County land records. Coconino County didn't exist as a separate jurisdiction until 1891. The deed contained 7 covenants. Article 9, Section 4 was the one Carol had flagged. 9 lines of Victorian legal language, drafted by a territorial land attorney named Silas Pratt, permanently exempting the property from encumbrance by any future private association, homeowners organization, or collective land management body formed after the date of original grant. The language was not ambiguous. It was not a gray area. It had been written by a man whose entire professional purpose was to make property rights survive political change, because in 1868, nobody knew what kind of government was coming next. The 2003 boundary expansion couldn't touch my property. It never could. Victoria Hale either knew that and was betting I didn't, or she hadn't done the research she should have done before she showed up at my door with a clipboard. Either way, the same question was forming clearly now. If she was willing to file a legally impossible claim against a property with a documented exemption, what had she been filing against the properties without one? I didn't go home after that. I went to see a forensic accountant named Paul Dreiser, who had done subcontract work on 3 county projects I'd managed and who owed me a professional conversation. What does it tell you about a person when their first move is a claim they can only win if you don't know your own rights? Paul Dreiser worked out of a small office in Flagstaff above a tax preparation firm. He was 63, semi-retired, and had the particular manner of a man who had spent 4 decades looking at numbers that didn't add up and had stopped being surprised by what he found behind them. I gave him the HOA's public financial filings, 3 years of assessed dues records, expenditure reports, and reserve fund statements, all of which were accessible through the county recorder under Arizona's nonprofit disclosure requirements. I didn't tell him what I was looking for. I never do that with people whose professional opinion I need. You tell someone what you're looking for, you risk getting back a confirmation instead of an analysis. He called me 4 days later. Dale, he said, roughly $200,000 in collected assessments over the past 36 months have no corresponding expenditure documentation, no vendor invoices, no contractor receipts, no reserve fund deposits. The money came in. The money went somewhere. But there's no paper trail that tells you where. I asked him if that was unusual. For a legitimate HOA managing a development this size, he said, it's not unusual. It's impossible. I thanked him and told him I'd be in touch. I sat with that information for a full day before I did anything with it. Here is where I want to be honest about something, because this is the part of the story where the easy move, the emotionally satisfying move, would have been to pick up the phone and call Victoria Hale directly. Tell her I had the covenant. Tell her I had the financial discrepancy. Tell her I was one conversation away from making her life significantly more complicated, and that if she withdrew the lien filing and left my property alone, I'd let the rest of it go. I could have done that. Part of me wanted to, but I kept coming back to Margaret Osley in Tempe, and to the 11 properties I was beginning to map, addresses I'd been cross-referencing against Pinnacle Ridge's acquisition history. All of them purchased below market value by Victoria's LLC within 18 months of a manufactured HOA violation. Elderly owners. Isolated disputes. No pattern visible unless you were looking at all of them simultaneously. If I called Victoria and threatened her privately, she'd stop. She'd pull back, regroup, wait 6 months, and then do it again to someone else who didn't have an 1868 deed or a forensic accountant in their contact list. A private warning wasn't justice. It was just displacement. So I said nothing. I opened a new folder on my desk, labeled it with a date, and I started building what an engineer would call a complete load analysis. Every force acting on the structure, measured and documented, before a single support is touched. Is it a moral failure to stay silent when you have the power to stop something? Or is it sometimes the only way to stop it completely? Over the next 10 days, I did 3 things. I did them quietly, without announcing them to anyone, and I did them in the specific order that made each one more useful than it would have been alone. First, I contacted the Arizona Attorney General's Real Estate Fraud Unit. Not to file a formal complaint, not yet. I called the intake line, described the pattern I was seeing, and asked whether they had any open investigations involving HOA boundary expansion fraud in Coconino County. The investigator I spoke with, a woman named Reyes, listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "I can't discuss active investigations. But I'd encourage you to document everything you have and keep it organized." That was enough. It told me the door was already open. I just needed to bring the right documents to it. Second, I drove the neighborhood. Slowly, on 3 separate afternoons, with a county parcel map on the passenger seat. I identified 9 properties that had transferred to Pinnacle Ridge, affiliated LLCs, in the past 4 years. 3 more were in various stages of what appeared to be the same manufactured violation cycle Margaret Osley had gone through. Notices, escalating fines, confusion, attrition. I photographed the public-facing violation postings on 2 of them. Dates and addresses went into the folder. Third, I did nothing about Victoria Hale's 30-day deadline. I let it pass. I want to be precise about that decision, because it was the most calculated thing I did in this entire sequence. I didn't miss the deadline by accident. I ignored it deliberately because I needed her to file the lien. A threat on paper is a threat. A lien on record is evidence. I needed her committed, fully, publicly, irreversibly, before I moved. She filed on day 32. I was at my kitchen table when the certified mail arrived. I opened it, read it twice, added it to the folder, and poured myself a second cup of coffee. The trap had another layer now, and she'd walked into it herself. How many moves ahead do you have to see before staying still stops feeling like losing? The lien filing changed the geometry of everything. Until that point, Victoria Hale had made threats. Threats are retrievable. A person can walk them back, reframe them, claim misunderstanding. A recorded lien on a property deed is none of those things. It is a public document, time-stamped, bearing her organization's name and her signature as president, asserting a legal claim against land that a 9-line covenant from 1868 made categorically immune to exactly this kind of encumbrance. She had just signed her name to a provably false legal filing. I called an attorney that afternoon. Not a general practice firm. A property rights attorney named Susan Calloway who specialized in deed covenant enforcement and had successfully argued 2 cases before the Arizona Court of Appeals involving HOA overreach. I'd found her through my old engineering network, the same way I'd found Paul Dreiser. When you spend 3 decades on infrastructure projects, you accumulate a specific kind of contact list. People who understand systems, who know where documents live, and who don't waste time on things that can't be proven. I gave Susan everything. The 1868 deed, Carol's annotated notebook, which she held carefully, the way a librarian would, the 2003 boundary expansion filing, Paul Dreiser's analysis of the financial discrepancy, the certified lien notice, the property transfer records I'd mapped over the previous 10 days. She read through it for 20 minutes without speaking. "Dale," she said finally, "this covenant is as clean as anything I've seen at this level. The lien is void on its face. We could have this dismissed in a single hearing." "I know," I said, "but I don't want it dismissed quietly." She looked up from the notebook. I told her what I wanted. Not just the lien removed. I wanted the hearing scheduled for the earliest available date, public docket, open courtroom. I wanted the full boundary expansion filing challenged on record. And I wanted her to coordinate with the AG's office, because investigator Reyes had indicated they were building something and needed a clean evidentiary bridge between their investigation and a live court proceeding. Susan was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded, slowly, the way engineers nod when the load calculations finally confirm what they suspected from the beginning. Then we don't file defensively, she said. We file to expose. That's correct, I said. I drove home, added Susan's retainer agreement to the folder, and sat on the porch until the sun went behind the mesa. The ranch was very quiet. It has a particular silence in the early evening, thick, unhurried, older than anyone alive. I didn't feel rushed at all. While I was building the case quietly, Victoria Hale was not standing still. Within a week of filing the lien, she sent a second certified letter. This one informed me that under Pinnacle Ridge HOA bylaws, properties with outstanding assessments and recorded liens were subject to mandatory compliance inspections. An inspector would be visiting my property within 10 business days to document any additional code violations. Any violations found would be added to the outstanding balance. I read the letter twice. I added it to the folder. The inspector arrived on a Thursday morning, a young man with a clipboard and the uncomfortable manner of someone doing a job he hadn't fully thought through. He walked the fence line on my western parcel, photographed the barn, measured the setback distance between my largest outbuilding and the property boundary, and spent 20 minutes examining a section of adobe wall on the north face of the main house that had been repaired in 1987. He left without saying much. 2 weeks later, a third certified letter arrived. Victoria's organization was now claiming an additional $3,400 in code violation penalties. Improper agricultural structure setback, non-compliant exterior wall repair material. And this was the one that required a moment to absorb. Failure to obtain HOA architectural approval for a fence post replacement I had completed the previous autumn. A fence post on land that had been continuously fenced since 1871. The total claim balance was now $17,600. I photographed the letter, added it to the folder, and called Susan Calloway to make sure the new violations were documented as part of the pattern rather than treated as separate disputes. She confirmed they would be. She also told me the hearing date had been set, Coconino County Superior Court, 22 days out. 22 days. I thought about that fence post for a while. The original posts along the western line were hand-cut juniper, sunk by Elias Mercer himself in the 1870s. The one I'd replaced last October had finally rotted through after roughly 100 years of service. I'd cut the replacement from the same stand of juniper on the north pasture. Some things don't need architectural approval. They just need time. 10 days before the hearing, Victoria Hale held a Pinnacle Ridge HOA community meeting. I know what was said there because Gerald Whitmore, my neighbor to the east, the retired schoolteacher, attended out of curiosity and called me afterward. Gerald is 71, careful with words, and not given to exaggeration. He told me what he heard and then asked if I was all right. Victoria had addressed roughly 40 residents in the Pinnacle Ridge Clubhouse. According to Gerald, she opened by describing the lien filing as a necessary protective measure against a neighboring property owner who had, in her words, refused all reasonable attempts at communication and was actively resisting the community's standards that protect everyone's property values. Then she said something that Gerald repeated to me twice, because he wanted to make sure he had it right. Some people, she told the room, go quiet because they know they're wrong and they're hoping the problem goes away. Mr. Mercer has had every opportunity to resolve this cooperatively. His silence tells you everything you need to know about whether he has a legitimate case. Gerald said several people nodded. I listened to all of this without interrupting him. When he finished, I thanked him and asked if he'd be willing to write down what he'd heard, as accurately as he could, and sign it. He said yes without hesitating. I want to sit with Victoria's logic for a moment, because it is worth examining carefully. She had interpreted 30 days of non-response as an admission of weakness. She had interpreted the missed payment deadline as confirmation that I had nothing to say. She had stood in front of 40 of her residents and publicly declared that my silence was evidence against me, that a man who doesn't argue back must not have an argument. In her world, that logic probably held. The people she had successfully processed before, Margaret Osley, the 11 others, they had gone quiet because they were overwhelmed. Because the paperwork was confusing and the fines kept growing and the machinery of attrition was doing exactly what it was designed to do. She assumed I was the same kind of quiet. She had no framework for the other kind. The kind that isn't confusion or fear or resignation. The kind that is simply a man sitting at a kitchen table with a folder that keeps getting thicker, waiting for the right room, the right day, the right moment to open it. How dangerous is it to mistake someone's silence for surrender, when that silence is actually a countdown? 3 days after the community meeting, Victoria escalated again. Her attorney, a Scottsdale firm named Ardmore and Crick, the kind of practice that has a receptionist who answers the phone on the first ring and charges accordingly, filed an emergency motion in Coconino County Superior Court requesting receivership of my property pending resolution of the lien dispute. The motion argued that my continued non-payment and non-cooperation represented an imminent threat to the financial integrity of the Pinnacle Ridge community, and that court-appointed receivership was necessary to prevent further assessment delinquency. Receivership on a property that had been in continuous family ownership for 157 years. Susan Calloway called me within an hour of the filing hitting the docket. Her voice was measured, but I could hear the particular tension of an attorney who has just seen an opponent overreach in a way that changes the entire shape of a case. "They've handed us something," she said. "I know," I said. "An emergency receivership motion requires the filing party to demonstrate immediate, irreparable harm." To meet that standard, Ardmore and Crick had submitted 3 supporting affidavits, signed statements from Pinnacle Ridge residents attesting to the damage my noncompliance was causing the community. Gerald called me that evening to tell me his name had been listed as a potential affiant and that he had declined, firmly, and that 2 of the 3 residents who had signed were people Victoria had personally recruited at the community meeting. The affidavits described me as erratic, combative, and unwilling to engage in good faith resolution. One of them stated that I had made threatening remarks to a HOA representative during a site inspection. That would have been the young man with the clipboard on the Thursday morning. I had offered him a glass of water and asked him to close the gate on his way out. Susan filed our response within 48 hours. She did not simply contest the receivership motion. She filed a counter-motion challenging the legal validity of the 2003 boundary expansion, attached the 1868 covenant as Exhibit A, submitted Paul Dreiser's financial analysis as Exhibit B, and included Gerald Whitmore's signed written account of Victoria's community meeting statements as Exhibit C. She also made a phone call to investigator Reyes at the AG's office. Reyes, it turned out, had been waiting for exactly this moment. A live court proceeding with a public docket gave her unit the jurisdictional footing they needed to move from investigative to enforcement posture. Within 72 hours of Susan's counterfiling, the AG's office had issued a formal litigation hold notice to Pinnacle Ridge HOA, freezing all financial accounts pending a fraud examination. Victoria's attorney requested a continuance the following morning. The judge denied it. The hearing was still on. 8 days out. Public docket. Open courtroom. And now, seated quietly in the gallery on the day it convened, there would be a state investigator whose presence would not require any explanation to anyone paying attention. The machinery Victoria had set in motion, the lien, the inspector, the affidavits, the emergency receivership motion, had done exactly what I needed it to do. It had built a record large enough, public enough, and legally committed enough that no single piece of it could be quietly withdrawn. She had tightened every bolt herself. When a system is designed to intimidate, what happens the moment it encounters someone who understands the system better than the person running it? 5 days before the hearing, Gerald Whitmore came over in the early evening and sat with me on the porch. He brought a thermos of coffee, which is his way of saying he intends to stay long enough for a real conversation. Gerald is not a man who visits casually. In 30 years of neighboring this property, he has come to the door perhaps a dozen times. Always with a reason, always with something specific to say. He poured 2 cups and looked out at the western pasture for a while without speaking. The sun was low, cutting long shadows across the juniper fence line. The posts Elias Mercer sank 150 years ago were still standing, dark with age, solid as the day they were set. "Dale," he said finally, "I've been watching what's been happening to this place. The letters, the inspector, that business at the meeting." He paused. "I want you to know I signed the statement Susan asked for." But I also want to ask you something directly. I told him to go ahead. You've had that covenant the whole time, haven't you? It wasn't entirely a question. Since the morning she left, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded, slowly, the way a man nods when something he suspected turns out to be true and he isn't sure whether to feel relieved or unsettled by the confirmation. I thought so, he said. The way you didn't argue with her. The way you just watched. He turned his coffee cup in both hands. I've been telling myself you knew what you were doing. That you had a reason for letting it go this far. I did, I said. I know. Another pause. I just needed to hear you say it. We sat there for a while after that without talking much. Gerald finished his coffee and stood to leave just as the last light was going behind the mesa. At the porch steps, he turned back. Margaret Osley called me last week, he said. She asked if there was any news about the HOA situation. I told her there might be something happening soon. He looked at me steadily. I hope it's enough to help her too. That's the plan, I said. He nodded once more and walked back across the gravel drive to his property. I watched him go, then looked out at the fence line again, juniper posts, handset, still standing. Some structures just need someone willing to defend them. 4 days before the hearing, Ardmore and Crick sent a letter directly to my home address. Not to Susan. To me, personally, which was itself a procedural irregularity significant enough that Susan flagged it immediately and added it to the court record. The letter was signed by a senior partner named William Crick, and it contained, buried in the third paragraph beneath 2 pages of legal formality, something I had not expected. An offer. Pinnacle Ridge HOA would agree to withdraw the lien filing and suspend all outstanding assessments in exchange for a signed easement granting the HOA permanent landscape management authority over my western parcel boundary, a 12-foot strip running the full length of my fence line. The easement would be recorded against my deed. It would transfer with the property in perpetuity. I read it 3 times. It was, in its own way, an elegant move. They weren't asking for money anymore. They were asking for a permanent legal foothold on my property, something smaller than the original claim, reasonable sounding on its surface, the kind of thing a tired man might sign just to make the whole ordeal stop. And once it was recorded against the deed, it would be an encumbrance that no covenant from 1868 would retroactively remove, because I would have signed it voluntarily after the covenant's protections had been clearly established. They had shifted from brute force to precision, which meant someone in that office, possibly Crick himself, had read the covenant and understood what it meant for the lien. They were trying to salvage something before the hearing took everything. I called Susan. "Don't sign anything," she said, before I finished describing the letter. "I wasn't going to," I said. "Good. Because if you sign that easement, you've given them exactly what they came for, just through a different door. The lien goes away, the hearing loses its urgency, and whatever the AG's office is building loses its anchor case." She paused. "This letter tells us they're scared, Dale. People don't offer concessions when they think they're winning." She was right. And the timing told me something else as well. 4 days before a public hearing, with a state investigator already positioned in the gallery and a financial fraud examination running parallel, this offer wasn't strategy. It was a pressure valve. They were hoping I'd take it because the alternative, from their position, was a courtroom they could no longer control. I drafted a 1-sentence reply, which Susan reviewed and sent on my behalf through proper legal channels. "Mr. Mercer declines the easement offer and will see you at the hearing. 3 days. What does an offer of compromise tell you about the strength of the person making it and the timing of when they make it?" 2 days before the hearing, Investigator Reyes called me directly. She had not done this before. Every prior contact had gone through Susan, routed through proper channels, careful and procedural. A direct call meant something had changed in the posture of her investigation, that she was no longer managing information flow. She was confirming it. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "I want to make sure you understand what's going to be in that courtroom on Thursday." I told her I was listening. What she described took 20 minutes. I sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and wrote down the framework of it, not because I would need the notes later, but because I am an engineer and I process complex information better when I can see its structure on paper. The AG's Real Estate Fraud Unit had been investigating Pinnacle Ridge HOA and its affiliated entities for 14 months before I first called the intake line. My call had not initiated their investigation, It had confirmed the final piece of a pattern they had been assembling from 7 separate complaint files, none of which had been individually sufficient to move to enforcement. What I had handed Investigator Reyes, through Susan's counterfiling, was something prosecutors call a clean anchor case, a single, fully documented instance of the scheme, with an unimpeachable property record, a provably false legal filing, a forensic financial analysis, and a living witness who had attended the community meeting where the scheme's architect had publicly mischaracterized her own conduct. The 11 property acquisitions through Victoria's LLC, Reyes confirmed it was 11, matching my own count, had been executed through a consistent methodology: manufactured HOA violations, escalating fines, manufactured assessment debt, followed by a below-market purchase offer from the LLC arriving within 60 days of the first violation notice. In 8 of the 11 cases, the former owners had been over 70 years old. In 6 of those 8, they had been living alone. The financial discrepancy Paul Dreiser had identified, the $200,000 in unaccounted assessments, traced, through the AG's forensic accounting, to a series of transfers into a management fee account controlled by a shell company registered in Nevada with no employees, no physical address, and a sole director whose name was a variation of Victoria Hale's maiden name. Reyes told me one more thing before she ended the call. The boundary expansion filing from 2003, she said. The signature on it, Robert Caslin, the board president at the time. We've spoken with Mr. Caslin. He states he never authorized that expansion and does not recognize his signature on the document. A forged signature. On a county recorder filing. The foundation of every claim Victoria Hale had made against my property, and, by extension, against every property her organization had touched, rested on a document that should never have existed. I set down my pen and looked at the legal pad. The structure was complete. Every load-bearing element was in place, cross-braced, documented, and independently verified. There was nothing left to wait for. Tomorrow I would drive to Flagstaff. Thursday morning, I would walk into Coconino County Superior Court with a folder that had been growing for 11 weeks. It was time to open it. The night before the hearing, Ardmore and Crick filed a supplemental motion. Susan called me at 8:47 p.m. I could hear it in her voice before she said a word. The specific tension of an attorney who has just watched an opponent do something unexpected and is still calculating what it means. The supplemental motion requested that the court recognize a 2019 amendment to the Pinnacle Ridge HOA bylaws, an amendment that, according to the filing, superseded all prior deed covenant restrictions within the HOA's recorded boundary by invoking an Arizona statute governing Planned Community Authority over annexed parcels. The motion argued that regardless of the 1868 covenant's original validity, the 2019 amendment had legally extinguished its protective provisions under the doctrine of regulatory modernization. I had never heard of the 2019 amendment. Neither had Susan, until that moment. Is it real? I asked. It's recorded, she said carefully. Whether it's legally valid is a different question. But it's recorded, it's in front of the judge as of tonight, and we have approximately 12 hours to respond before the hearing opens. I sat with that for a moment. The 2019 amendment had been filed quietly, not through the county recorder's standard process, but through a supplemental HOA filing mechanism that receives considerably less public scrutiny. It had been recorded during the height of the pandemic, when county offices were operating with reduced staff and expedited processing backlogs. Susan pulled the original filing within the hour. It bore the signatures of 3 Pinnacle Ridge board members. 2 of those board members, she confirmed after 2 phone calls, had sold their properties and left the development in 2020 and 2021 respectively. Neither had any recollection of approving a bylaw amendment in 2019. It was, in other words, a second forged document, newer, more targeted, and filed specifically to neutralize the covenant that Victoria Hale had apparently known about far longer than she had let on. But Susan's immediate problem was not its authenticity. Her immediate problem was that it was now in the court record. The judge would have read it by morning, and our entire hearing strategy had been built around the covenant as an uncontested primary instrument. If the judge gave the 2019 amendment even provisional weight, the lien dismissal was no longer a foregone conclusion. The hearing could be continued. The case could drag into months of appellate argument about statutory interpretation, during which the lien would remain on my deed. The AG's case would lose its anchor, and Victoria Hale would have time to restructure, relocate assets, and insulate herself from the financial fraud examination. This was the scenario I had spent 11 weeks trying to prevent. I asked Susan what she needed from me. She needed the original county recorder's processing logs for the 2019 filing, specifically the intake timestamp, the reviewing clerk's initials, and the chain of custody documentation showing which office had authorized expedited processing. Records that existed in the county system but required a formal records request to surface. Records that, under normal circumstances, would take 3 to 5 business days to produce. It was 9:15 p.m. The hearing opened at 9 a.m. I called a retired Coconino County records clerk named Howard Beal, whom I had worked with on 3 infrastructure projects over the past decade. I had helped his department navigate a federal compliance audit in 2016 that would have cost them a significant grant. Howard had told me at the time that if I ever needed anything from his end of the system, I should call him directly. I called him directly. He called me back in 40 minutes with everything Susan needed, pulled from the archived intake logs he still had access to through a consultant arrangement with the county. The 2019 filing had been processed by a clerk who had retired in 2021. The intake timestamp was irregular, logged outside normal business hours. The chain of custody showed a single reviewer approval with no secondary sign-off, which was required by county procedure for any HOA supplemental filing affecting recorded deed instruments. Procedurally defective. Independently of its forged signatures, the filing itself had never been properly authorized. Susan had her response drafted and filed by 1:30 a.m. I didn't sleep much that night. I sat at the kitchen table with Carol's third notebook open in front of me, not reading it, just letting it be there. Her handwriting on the page. Her red annotation beside Article 9, Section 4. Check this. This matters. She had been right about that for a long time. When everything you've built is an hour from being tested, what do you hold on to remember why you held on this long? I left for Flagstaff at 6:45 a.m. The drive takes just under an hour from the ranch. I've made it hundreds of times. County meetings, project sites, supply runs, the hospital in Carol's last months. The high desert at that hour has a particular quality of light, flat, clear, without sentiment. It doesn't comfort you. It just shows you what's there. I thought about Carol for most of the drive. Not the illness. I've made a discipline of not going there first. I thought about the version of her that existed before it, the woman who spent 15 years cataloging a property she had come to by marriage and chosen to treat as a primary responsibility. She didn't do it because anyone asked her to. She did it because she understood that the record of a place is part of the place itself, and that records require maintenance the same way structures do. Neglect them long enough, and they stop being protection. They become vulnerability. She had flagged Article 9 in the third notebook 3 years before she passed. I had never asked her why she flagged it specifically, and she had never explained. She wasn't the kind of person who explained her instincts. She documented them and trusted that the documentation would speak when the moment required it. It was speaking now. I thought about what it had cost to wait. Not strategically. I'd made peace with the strategy. I mean the other cost. The certified letters stacking up on the kitchen table. The inspector walking my fence line, photographing a barn that had stood since 1902. The community meeting, 40 people nodding while Victoria Hale told them my silence was admission. The night before, Susan's voice at 8:47 p.m. and the hours that followed. There is a particular loneliness to knowing something that you cannot yet say. It sits differently than ordinary patience. It has weight. Some mornings I walked out to the western pasture before sunrise and stood at the fence line and felt the full pressure of what was bearing down on this property, not abstractly, but as a physical thing, like load on a structure. And I held it, the way a well-built wall holds load, without showing the strain on the surface. Carol would have understood that. She had her own version of it, the librarian's discipline of sitting with a document long enough to understand what it actually says, rather than what you want it to say. I pulled into the courthouse parking lot at 7:52 a.m. I sat in the truck for a few minutes. I looked at the folder on the passenger seat, thick now, organized, every tab labeled in Carol's kind of order. Then I picked it up, got out, and walked inside. Coconino County Superior Court, Courtroom 4 opened at 9:03 a.m. The room was not large. Wood paneling, fluorescent lighting, 3 rows of gallery seating. Susan was already at the respondent's table when I came in, her files organized with the particular precision of someone who had been awake since 1:30 in the morning and had converted that sleeplessness into preparation. I sat beside her and placed the folder on the table between us. Victoria Hale arrived at 9:07. She came in with William Crick and a younger associate carrying 2 banker's boxes. She was dressed the way she had been dressed on my porch 11 weeks earlier. Range Rover professional, clipboard confidence, the presentation of a person accustomed to rooms going the way she arranges them. She did not look at me when she sat down. That told me something. People who are certain they're winning look at the person they're beating. People who are managing uncertainty look at their paperwork. In the 3rd row of the gallery, a woman in a dark blazer with a government-issue lanyard sat with a notepad and said nothing to anyone. Investigator Reyes. I had not met her in person before that morning. She was younger than her voice had suggested, mid-40s, still, watchful. She caught my eye once when I turned briefly and gave a single, small nod. The judge was the Honorable Patricia Severn, appointed to the Coconino bench 11 years prior. She had the manner of someone who has read everything submitted to her court and has opinions about the quality of the submissions. She called the proceeding to order, confirmed both parties were present, and looked down at the filing stack in front of her with an expression that suggested she had been up since 1:30 as well. Before we begin, Judge Severn said, I want to address the supplemental motion filed by petitioner at 9:22 p.m. last evening. Crick straightened. Victoria's jaw set slightly. I have reviewed respondent's counter-response filed at 1:34 a.m., including the Coconino County Recorder's intake log documentation attached as Exhibit F. She paused. The 2019 bylaw amendment cited in petitioner's supplemental motion was processed outside standard business hours without required secondary authorization. Under Arizona Administrative Code Section 33 to 1803, a supplemental HOA filing affecting recorded deed instruments requires dual reviewer certification. That certification is absent from this record. She set the filing aside. The 2019 amendment is procedurally defective and will not be considered by this court. We will proceed on the original record. Crick leaned toward his associate and said something I couldn't hear. Victoria did not move. Susan presented our case in 31 minutes. She entered the 1868 territorial deed as Exhibit A and read Article 9, Section 4 into the record in full, 9 lines, Victorian legal language, every word of it as clean and unambiguous as the day Silas Pratt drafted it. She entered the 2003 boundary expansion filing as Exhibit B and identified the signature of Robert Caslin, then submitted a sworn affidavit from Caslin himself stating he had never authorized the expansion and did not recognize his signature on the document. She entered Paul Dreiser's financial analysis as Exhibit C, Gerald Whitmore's signed account of the community meeting as Exhibit D, the procedurally defective 2019 amendment documentation as Exhibit E, and the recorder's intake logs as Exhibit F. Then she said, Your Honor, the lien filed against the Mercer property on day 32 of petitioner's notice period rests entirely on a boundary expansion that cannot legally incorporate a property protected by a recorded deed covenant, executed on the basis of a forged signatory authorization, and enforced through a pattern of manufactured violations that this court's record now documents across 11 separate property transactions in Coconino County. We are asking for dismissal of the lien, vacator of all associated assessments, and referral of the boundary expansion filing to the Arizona Attorney General's Office for fraud investigation. She sat down. Judge Severn looked at Crick. Counsel, your response. Crick stood. He was a practiced attorney. I'll give him that. He argued the boundary expansion's statutory validity for 11 minutes without once addressing the forged signature, the covenant language, or the financial discrepancy. He argued that the 2019 amendment, procedural defects notwithstanding, reflected the community's legitimate regulatory interest. He argued that my non-payment represented a pattern of deliberate non-cooperation. Judge Severn let him finish. Then she said, Does petitioner have a response to the Caslin affidavit? Crick paused. We believe Mr. Caslin's recollection may be imperfect given the passage of time. His recollection, the judge said evenly, is supported by a forensic document examiner's report submitted by respondent as Exhibit G, which I received at 7:15 this morning and which concludes with a high degree of certainty that the signature on the 2003 filing is not consistent with Mr. Caslin's known signature samples. She looked at him steadily. Do you have a response to that? Crick did not have a response to that. Judge Severn looked down at the record for a long moment. The courtroom was very quiet. I could hear the ventilation system. I could hear someone in the gallery shift in their seat. The lien filed against the Mercer property is dismissed, she said. All associated assessments are vacated. The court finds that the 2003 boundary expansion filing contains a materially defective authorization and refers the matter to the Arizona Attorney General's office for investigation of potential fraud. She initialed the order. This proceeding is concluded. 11 minutes. She had said 11 minutes. The actual time from her opening ruling on the 2019 amendment to the final gavel was 11 minutes and 40 seconds. I know because I checked my watch when it was over, the same way I had checked it on my porch 11 weeks earlier at 9:14 a.m. on a Tuesday in April. The record stays clean when you timestamp everything. Victoria Hale stood for a moment after the gavel, perfectly still, like a structure that has just had its primary support removed and hasn't yet registered the implications of that fact. Then she gathered her things and walked out without speaking to anyone. Crick followed, his associate carrying the two banker's boxes that had not been opened. Investigator Reyes was already on her phone when I turned around. Susan put her hand briefly on my arm. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. I sat there for a moment after the room began to clear. I looked at the folder on the table, tabs labeled in Carol's kind of order, everything in its right place. The complete load analysis of 11 weeks of patience and documentation and strategic silence. Then I closed it. When the room goes quiet after the gavel, and you realize the stillness you've been carrying all this time was never weakness, it was the structure itself holding. What does that feel like? Victoria Hale was indicted 4 months later. The charges were fraud, embezzlement, elder financial exploitation, and filing forged instruments with a county recorder, the last of which carries a Class 4 felony designation under Arizona statute. The indictment named her personally, her affiliated LLC, and 2 individuals who had served as nominal board members and signed documents they later claimed not to have read. Ardmore and Crick withdrew from representation before the criminal proceedings began. The Pinnacle Ridge HOA was dissolved by court order 60 days after the indictment. Its remaining assets, including the reserve fund balances that Paul Dreiser's analysis had flagged, were placed in receivership pending distribution to former members who had paid assessments into a system now confirmed to have been fraudulent from its boundary expansion forward. 7 of the 11 forced property acquisitions were reversed through civil litigation coordinated by the AG's office. Margaret Osley was among the 7. She moved back to her property in October. Gerald told me she replanted her front garden the following spring. I never raised my voice once throughout the entire process. That's not a boast. It's closer to a reminder, to myself as much as anyone, that there is a kind of strength that doesn't announce itself, that operates through precision rather than volume, that understands the difference between reacting to a provocation and responding to it, and knows that the distance between those two things is where outcomes are actually determined. Carol would have appreciated that distinction. She spent her career in rooms full of documents that other people had dismissed as outdated, superseded, no longer relevant, and she understood that a record doesn't lose its authority just because someone has decided to stop paying attention to it. The 1868 covenant had been sitting in that deed for 157 years. It didn't need me to defend it. It needed me to present it at the right moment, in the right room, to the right person with the authority to recognize what it meant. Timing isn't hesitation. It's precision applied to the dimension of time rather than space. Any engineer understands this. You don't apply load before the structure is ready to receive it. You don't release the counterweight before the balance point is confirmed. You wait. You verify. You move when the conditions are exactly right and not a moment before. The ranch is still standing. The adobe walls Elias Mercer laid in 1868 are still carrying the roof he designed them to carry. The juniper fence posts along the western line, the ones he sank himself, The ones that had been standing longer than anyone alive are still standing too. The one I replaced last autumn fits the line without a gap. Some things just need to be maintained, defended when necessary, left alone to do what they were built to do, by people who understood that certain structures are meant to outlast the arguments made against them. If an HOA has ever filed a claim against your property, drop your state in the comments below. And before you pay a single dollar, before you sign a single thing, go find your original deed. Read every covenant. Read every line. The answer you need might have been sitting there for a very long time. What else have we been told is outdated? That was actually just waiting for the right moment to matter again. But here's what this story was really about. It was never really about an HOA. It was never about $14,000 or fence posts or a boundary line drawn on a 2003 filing. It was about what happens when someone builds a system designed to exploit one specific human weakness, the tendency to comply when you're confused, when you're tired, when the paperwork is overwhelming and the clock is running, and someone in a Range Rover is already walking away like the matter is settled. Victoria Hale wasn't unusual. That's the uncomfortable truth. She was just unusually organized. The playbook she was running, manufactured violations, escalating pressure, attrition by bureaucracy, it works. It works on most people. It worked on 11 of Dale's neighbors before it reached his porch. What she never accounted for was meeting someone who understood the system better than she did, and who was patient enough to let her build her own trap before he closed it. That's why she lost. Not because Dale was more aggressive. Not because he was louder or more connected or had more money. She lost because she misread his silence. She stood in front of 40 people and told them his quietness was weakness. She filed more documents. She sent more letters. She escalated, because that's what you do when you're used to people crumbling. And every single move she made went straight into a folder. That's the thing about people who abuse systems for long enough. They start to believe the system is theirs. They stop checking whether the ground beneath them is solid. They assume that because something has always worked, it will always work, right up until the moment a judge sets aside their 2019 amendment in the first 4 minutes of a hearing and asks if they have a response to the forged signature. They never do. Dale won because he understood something most people don't. That patience isn't passivity. Silence isn't surrender. Waiting isn't weakness. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing. Visible. While doing everything. Quietly. He didn't win in spite of his stillness. He won because of it. Every day he held still, she committed further. Every letter she sent, every lien she filed, every affidavit she fabricated, she was building his case for him, one document at a time. And when the moment finally came, he didn't need to be angry. He didn't need to perform outrage or demand to be taken seriously. He just opened the folder. Most of us have met some version of Victoria Hale. Maybe not in a homeowners association. Maybe in a workplace. A landlord. A bureaucracy. Someone who came at you with paperwork and pressure and the quiet assumption that you don't know your own rights. And that even if you do, you're too tired to use them. What Dale's story is really asking is this. How long could you hold that kind of stillness? Knowing everything, saying nothing, watching someone build their own case against themselves, before you broke and showed your hand too soon. Drop your answer in the comments. I read every one. And if you're drawn to stories about quiet preparation, careful documentation, and the kind of patience that actually changes outcomes, there's more where this came from.